Hey everyone, welcome back to class. This week we're talking about utilitarianism. So last week we talked about deontology and consequentialism. We started on the sort of ethics section of the course, looking at two categories of views. Deontology says rules are really what matters in morality. If you're following the right ethical rules, then you're behaving morally, you're morally good. If you're breaking the moral rules, if you're lying, cheating, stealing, murdering, etc., then you're doing something morally wrong. You're behaving morally badly. And so morality comes down to whether you're following or violating the moral rules. And there are some consequences to that. Kantian ethics, which we looked at, for example, says you can't break the moral rules under any circumstances, which means you can't even lie to the murderer at the door. You can't lie to save a life because lying is wrong in any circumstance. And you might think that that's not good, that that's the wrong way to look at morality. Obviously, you can lie to save a life. That's the morally right thing to do in that situation, because the outcome of saving a life is more important than the fact that you had to lie to do it. And if you think that sounds right, then you may be inclined towards consequentialism, which is the category of views we talked about last week that say consequences are what matters. The outcome of your actions determines whether your action was good or bad. If your action made the world a better place, it was a morally good action. If your action made the world a worse place, it was a morally bad action. So if you tell the truth to the murderer at the door and someone got murdered because you told the truth, you made the world a worse place by telling the truth. And therefore, it was wrong for you to tell the truth in that case. Morally speaking, you should have lied to the murderer to save a life. And the most common form of consequentialism is utilitarianism. And so this week, we're going to look at what utilitarianism is in this video. And then in the next three videos, we'll look at why be utilitarian. And then we'll look at two thought experiments that are meant to object to utilitarianism. They're meant to show that utilitarianism must be false. So first things first, what is utilitarianism? And there are many forms of utilitarianism. So many people in the last few hundred years have defended versions of utilitarianism. You have act utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism, pure sort of pleasure utilitarianism. You have preference satisfaction utilitarianism. There are lots of different kinds. But we're just going to talk about what I take to be the main version of utilitarianism historically, which is Millian utilitarianism. And John Stuart Mill, who, besides writing about utilitarianism, also wrote about liberty and freedom and rights and other sort of political philosophy issues. He didn't invent utilitarianism, but he developed it and popularized it. And his version of utilitarianism is probably the most famous version historically. So that's what we're going to look at this week. So what is utilitarianism? Well, utilitarianism is the ethical view that what makes an action good or bad, morally good or bad, is how much utility is produced by that action. Utilitarianism, utility. More utility is better, less utility is worse. And this is a form of consequentialism because how much utility is produced by an action is a matter of what outcomes that action had. So according to utilitarianism, the morally best action is whatever action maximizes utility. Right? And a bad action is an action, or a morally bad action is an action that fails to maximize utility, or at least that reduces utility. So the less utility an action produces, the worse it is. And the more utility it destroys, if you reduce the total amount of utility, then the action was really bad. And this is consequentialist because it's focusing purely on outcomes. How much utility your action produces is a matter of what effects your action had on the world, what the outcomes of your actions were. After you perform the action, how much utility is there compared to how much there would have been if you didn't do that action? That's purely a matter of consequences. So intentions and rules don't matter here. We're not worried about why you did the action. We're not worried about what you had in mind, what your goals were, and we're not worried about what rules you were following or weren't following, what rules you were violating. It's just purely, regardless of what the action was, how much utility did it produce? So, obvious question to ask at this point is, what is utility? If utility is the thing that matters in morality, the thing we have to worry about producing if we want to be morally good people, then what is it? What is utility? In a word, happiness. Utility is happiness. The more happiness your action produces, the better the action was. The more unhappiness it produces, the worse it was. More utility means more happiness, and the maximum utility means the greatest total amount of happiness. So the maximum possible utility would be the greatest maximum amount of happiness in total in the world. So more utility means more happiness in the world. And that's what utility is. That's what utilitarians are worried about. And utilitarians accept what John Stuart Mill calls the greatest happiness principle. So Mill says actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and they are wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. The reverse of happiness, of course, being just a weird old-timey way of saying unhappiness. So morally right means produces happiness. The more happiness it produces, the more morally right it is. Morally wrong means produces unhappiness. The more unhappiness your action produces in the world, the morally worse that action was. So if you want to know why, say, murder is wrong, well, look at the fact that murder produces a lot of unhappiness in the world. That's what makes it wrong. Why is it morally good to donate money to charity? Well, because charities produce happiness in the people they help. And so donating money produces some happiness in the world. That's why charity is good. And that's why murder is bad, because of the effects they have on the total happiness in the world. Utilitarians think that this is the key concept to understand what is morally right and what's morally wrong. You just have to look at how much happiness it produces in the world. And if you think about the things that are morally wrong, or that you know are morally wrong, you'll see that they produce unhappiness in the world. It is wrong to torture people because being tortured produces a lot of unhappiness. It is good to compliment people because complimenting people produces a little bit of happiness. And that's all that there is to being morally good or morally bad. Doing the right thing or doing the wrong thing is just a matter of producing happiness, increasing total happiness in the world, or decreasing happiness, producing more unhappiness in the world. But now that we've said utility is happiness, now we got to ask, well, what is happiness? Because there are lots of different definitions. If you look up 4 different dictionaries, you'll get 4 slightly different definitions. What is it? And even if you look at dictionary definitions, those can be they can give you the general idea, but they're not going to give you the necessary and sufficient conditions that you want. They're not going to give you the full philosophical account that we're looking for in philosophy, like we talked about when we looked at knowledge. We want an account of what it is, not just a vague description that'll sort of get us the idea of how the word is used. And so Mill, John Stuart Mill, says that happiness, he says, by happiness is intended pleasure. and the absence of pain. So happiness is pleasure without pain. And he says, by unhappiness is, I intend to mean, pain and the privation of pleasure. So happiness means having pleasure and no pain. Unhappiness means having pain and no pleasure. So the more pleasure you have in your life, the happier you are. The more pain you have in your life, the unhappier you are. And so the more pleasure that an action causes, the more ethically right that action is. And the more pain it causes, the more ethically wrong that action is. So if you want to do the morally right thing, focus on causing pleasure and avoid causing pain. If you want to avoid doing the morally wrong thing, make sure not to cause any pain and try to cause some pleasure. An action that produces lots of pleasure and a little pain will be better than an action that produces no pleasure and no pain. So this is important. The amount of pleasure and pain produced by an action can weigh against each other. If an action produces a lot of pleasure and a little bit of pain, that's overall a good action, the utilitarian will say. And if an action produces a lot of pain in exchange for just a little bit of pleasure, then that's a bad action. So you can think of sort of the moral worth or the moral value of an action as being the total amount of pleasure it produces in the world minus the total amount of pain it produces in the world. Now, how do you quantify pleasure and pain? Good question. That's not totally clear. You might think that happiness is almost by definition not quantifiable. You can't measure pleasure and pain, you might think. But you have a general sense, I'm assuming, of what hurts worse than which things hurt worse than other things, and which things are more enjoyable than other things. You probably think that watching a movie with your friends is more pleasurable than being kicked in the shin. And so if you have a choice between watching a movie with your friends or being kicked in the shin, you'll choose watching the movie with your friends. And if you can choose between sending someone off to watch a movie with their friends or kicking them in the shin, morally speaking, the better thing to do is to send them off to watch a movie with their friends. If you can sort of order, okay, this is more painful than this, and this thing is more pleasurable than this, then you can sort of maybe you can't quantify it exactly, but you can make decisions about what it's better or worse for you to do in given circumstances. Or at least that's what the utilitarian thinks you can do and should be able to do. And just to be clear, pleasure and pain here are very broad. Mill uses pleasure and pain in very broad senses. So it's not just physical sensations that Mill has in mind. We're not just talking about physical pain and physical pleasurable sensations. Like, the taste of sugar is a physical sensation that is pleasurable. But reading a good book, maybe that's not a physical sensation, but it is an intellectual pleasure. It is a pleasure to read a book that you enjoy reading. Satisfaction at a job well done. Maybe it's not a physical sensation, but it is a form of pleasure. And so Mill, when he says pleasure and pain, he doesn't just mean that, physical pleasure and physical pain are what we should worry about. He thinks all pleasure and pain, broadly construed. And in fact, he thinks that sort of intellectual pleasures like good music and reading a good book are more valuable and are worth more than merely physical pleasures. So this isn't just trying to get physical sensations in your brain, pleasant physical sensations and avoid painful physical sensations. Mill thinks if that's all morality was reduced to, then humans would be no better than swine, but no better than pigs, because pigs can feel physical pain and physical pleasure, and that's kind of what guides their lives. So if that's all that guided our lives, that would be a pretty dim view of humanity, Mill thinks. So he wants to be very clear about this, that we're not just talking about physical sensations. Anything that you enjoy, basically, counts as a pleasure. And anything that you dislike counts as a pain. So it's not just physical pain, it's emotional pain, stress, worry, fear, disappointment, regret. All of these things count as pain for Mill. These are all forms of unhappiness that, if we want to do the morally right thing, we should try to avoid. If you can avoid disappointing someone, all else being equal, you should avoid disappointing them, because disappointment is a form of pain, and causing pain is morally bad. So you should avoid disappointing people, try to avoid scaring people, try to avoid stressing people out, because all of those are forms of pain. And that is ultimately what morality comes down to for utilitarians. Pleasure, broadly construed, and pain, broadly construed, are the things that we should worry about when we're trying to figure out what the right thing to do is. Because utilitarians think that the total amount of happiness is all that matters in morality. So take the total amount of pleasure in the world, subtract the total amount of pain in the world, and there you've got the total amount of happiness in the world. Make that bigger. Increase that is your moral duty, for lack of a better phrase. Utilitarians are less worried about duty as a general concept than Kant is and deontologists are. But if you're trying to do the right thing, increasing the total amount of happiness in the world is how you do the right thing on the utilitarian picture. That's what morality amounts to, is increasing the total amount of happiness in the world. And note, that doesn't mean increasing the number of happy people in the world. Right? If you can make 3 people a little happy, or make 1 person really, really happy, then as long as this 1 person's happiness outweighs these 3 people's happiness, you should make the 1 person happy. Given that choice, let's say you can give 1 point worth of happiness to 3 people, or give 5 points worth of happiness to 1 person. Utilitarian says, give the 5 points to the 1 person. That's increasing the total happiness in the world by 5 points versus only increasing it by 3 points. So making 3 people 1 point happy each increases the number of happy people in the world, but it doesn't increase the total amount of happiness in the world. Making 1 person absolutely ecstatic is better than making 10 people, all right, kind of happy, a nice chuckle or something. Like a little bit of happiness for 5 people is not necessarily better than a lot of happiness for 1 person. So it's not how many people are happy, it's the total amount of happiness. And it's not how happy you are. So utilitarianism says happiness is all that matters. You want to be happy. And it can sometimes sound like what they're saying is you should make yourself happy. And that's not what they're saying. Your happiness is not any more valuable than everyone else's. Your happiness is worth exactly as much as a stranger's happiness. If you can make yourself half as happy in order to make a stranger 3 times happier, you should do that. It will reduce your happiness, but it'll increase the total happiness in the world. And that's what you should be doing. Increasing the total happiness in the world, regardless of how much happiness you personally have. Your happiness is, in some sense, only as morally valuable as it increases the total happiness in the world, insofar as it increases the total happiness in the world. If you have to decrease other people's happiness in order to make yourself happier, if you're decreasing their happiness by more than you're increasing your own happiness, then you should not do that. It is morally wrong for you to do that on the utilitarian view. No one person is special. Every person's happiness is equal. Now, that doesn't mean every person has an equal amount of happiness. Some people are happier than others. You can make one person a lot happier than you make another person. But which person feels that extra happiness doesn't matter. Who is happy isn't important. Only how much happiness is there matters. How much happiness is there in the world? The total amount of happiness in the world. All the pleasure in the world minus all the pain in the world. Get that number as high as possible and you're doing something morally good. Reduce that number and you're doing something morally bad. So it doesn't matter who has the happiness or how many people it's divided across. It's just a matter of how much happiness is there in the world. And so they only care about the outcome. How much happiness was produced? How much happiness is there in the world? Did you make the world a happier place, or did you make the world a less happy place? That's the only moral question that matters, according to utilitarianism. Did you make the world a happier place, or did you make the world a less happy place? That's what morality comes down to. And that means that the end always justifies the means, as long as the end is producing as much happiness as possible. If your goal is to produce as much happiness as possible, then the utilitarian doesn't really care how you got there. As long as you made the world a happier place, you did the morally right thing. So, how does that apply to the trolley problems? Because we talked last week about the trolley problems, and we talked about what the Kantian says about it in deontology and consequentialism. And the utilitarian, like many consequentialists will end up saying, thinks that you should always kill the one to save five in the trolley problem. Even in the organ case, where you're killing someone in a hospital to harvest their organs to save five patients, you should always kill the one to save five in the trolley problem. Why? Because all else being equal, the happiness of five people is greater than the happiness of one person. And so five people living and surviving to go on and experience all of the happiness they'll experience later in life, that results in more happiness than only one person surviving and going on to experience all the happiness they'll experience later in life. Five people dying means five people who aren't adding to the greatest total happiness, who aren't adding to the world's total happiness. One person dying means only one person who isn't adding to the total happiness in the world. So if there are five people running around leading happy lives, that adds more to the total happiness in the world than one person running around and leading a happy life. So, in the organ case, you're presented with a choice. Do five people survive and lead happy lives? Or does one person survive and lead a happy life? And the utilitarian thinks, faced with that choice, the morally right thing to do is to choose five people surviving to lead happy lives. And the way to choose that is to kill the one person and harvest their organs. That results in more people leading happy lives, and so it results in a greater total happiness in the world. And so even though you have to murder someone to do it, it's the better outcome. Even if you have to kill someone and harvest their organs in order to bring about this increase in total happiness, you ought to do so. That is the morally right thing to do. in this case. And that surprises a lot of people. That you could end up saying that killing someone to harvest their organs is morally right. But as long as each of these 6 people are going to have roughly equally happy lives after this, then 5 people surviving to lead happy lives is better than 1 person surviving to lead a happy life. So even if you have to kill someone in a hospital closet to increase the total happiness in the world, utilitarianism says you should kill someone in that hospital closet and increase the total happiness in the world. That is what you have a moral obligation to do. That is the morally right thing to do. That is the best thing you could do in this case. Now, the best thing you could do is kill them painlessly, because that's still adding pain to the total would be worse. So kill them painlessly, certainly, but kill them. And you might think that's an extreme conclusion to draw. Kind of like the murder at the door case. It looked like Kantianism had this extreme conclusion. You can't lie even to save a life. And now it looks like utilitarianism has a similarly extreme conclusion here, that you can't avoid murdering someone. Morally, you ought to kill someone and harvest their organs. And that's the right thing to do. That seems like an extreme conclusion also. So why should we be utilitarians? If utilitarianism leads to these sorts of extreme conclusions, then why should we be utilitarian? Why should we think that this moral theory is correct? And that is the question we will look at in the next video. So I'm going to pause this video here, and we'll pick up in the next video, and we'll talk about why you should be utilitarian. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video.